Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, I have a huge announcement. This month, as I have mentioned before, I am going to be hosting a mega giveaway. So listen up if you want to hear how it works. There are 10 surprise mystery boxes up for grabs. A new box will be available every 3 days. To enter, all you need to do is leave a comment, leave a like, and press the little bell icon and be subscribed to Mortis Media. How easy is that? But there is a catch. You have to have left a like and a comment on each video that came out in the 3-day period in order for your entry to count. There is also going to be a handful of consolation prizes to those of you who didn't win the box, and will only be eligible to those who have commented and liked every video in May. Best of luck everyone, but for now it's time to hear about some shady characters that I'm sure you'd rather not meet, and let the darkness take control. This particular story haunts me to this day, and 20 years have passed since it happened. I was around 21 when this occurred. I was in the military at Fort Sill and didn't know it, but Desert Storm was right around the corner. At the time, I lived in South Central Oklahoma, on the outskirts of a small town called Duncan. I was helping a friend round up some cattle that got out because someone had run across a T-section and went through their fence. It tore 2 posts down and left a 30-foot section open for the cattle to just escape from. We already found most of the cattle and were missing another 3 or 4. So we were out until 1 AM on dirt bikes, trying to find them before someone hit them and sued his father. My friend and I went east, and the other guys went north and south. One thing you need to understand about Oklahoma is that most of it is either farmed by either cattle or crops, and it is also divided into 1-mile sections for the most part. In other words, the roads all run north, south, or east and west, and intersect at 1-mile intervals. If you ask for directions for something out in the country, you're more likely than not to be instructed to go 3 miles north and then 2 miles west. The area at the time was sparse, and there weren't many homes. We didn't know how long the hole had been in the fence. My friend's father only checked the fence because he was missing livestock. They owned the entire mile section and a good portion of the adjoining mile. The hole in the fence was on the east side of their land, at the furthest distance from their house. They checked the fence for such holes on a weekly basis. So the hole could not have been more than a day or 2 old. James and I were riding on these old dusty dirt bikes with battery-powered spotlights to both show the way and to search for cattle. We'd stop at any of the million small wooden bridges and look over to see if there were any cows down by the water. Our plan was to go out 10 miles, and then go over a mile section and drive back 10 times until we'd covered a total of 10 miles. Then we would do it all again, but on the north and south roads instead of the east and west roads. If you were to plot a map, it would just be a 10 by 10 grid. We had been at it since before 9 PM. Just as it was getting dark, and we'd already gone 10 miles out and about 3 miles over. I need to mention at this point that there are some mile sections that are not divided by roads, and you have to turn one way or another at a T intersection. If that happens, we always took the road that went in our general direction of travel. If we were travelling east and came to a T, we'd already checked the road north of us. Then we head to the south, a mile, and then east again. Occasionally, an old farmer would pass away and leave his land to relatives who had no interest in farming, and the land would be put up for sale or just left alone for years. When this happens and the roads aren't used as much, nature reclaims them, and you're usually left with a dirt road with weeds and grass going on it. Or you're left with a little more than an improved trail, usually 2 ruts with overgrown reeds and Johnson grass and occasionally a tree. We were on one of the rotted roads, heading south to the next intersection where we would turn east again. The land here was too hilly for cultivation and had been left alone for at least the last 30 years. We were both familiar with it, and we hunted and fished there. This mile section and the next 2 were basically wild, and at the end of the dirt trail would be a T intersection. But the west side was fenced, and the only option was to turn east again. And at the end of this mile, the road would just be a dead end, but we had to check it and then double back. We just made the turn back to the east when we saw something burning over the next rise. Grass fires are extremely dangerous and can get out of control in minutes. As we topped the rise, we saw the fire was actually in the middle of the dirt road. When we got to it, we found that it was a recliner that was burning. A blue lazy boy recliner. We stopped and threw some dirt on it and finally got it extinguished. James and I were wondering what kind of idiot would do this, and how strange it was to be just in the middle of the road on fire. Satisfied that it was no longer burning, we got back on our bikes and idled past the recliner towards the end of the mild section. Still, a quarter of the mile in the distance. We found one of their cows at the bottom of the rise, about 100 feet down from the road. It was laying half in and half out of the road. Its throat had been cut and was laying there with its eyes opened and tongue hanging out. There was blood everywhere. We were looking to try and figure out what happened, and James said, "Hey, look at this," and showed me where the blood had dripped from the cow to about 10 feet away from it. There were shoe prints of blood in the road. It was just part of a shoe print, but you could tell that it was a shoe print, and we found 2 more when we looked more diligently. At this point, their hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and it was suddenly a very cool evening. I looked at James, and his eyes were as big as saucers. He thought something spooky was happening too. We talked about going back, but we knew that we would be shamed if we didn't see if there was anything else. We finally decided to walk the bikes the rest of the way to the dead end, just in case there was someone there. We didn't want them to hear our engines. We began walking the last quarter of the mile or so to the dead end. It was at the base of the last hill, and we just started heading up on the other side. My heart was going about 200 miles an hour, and I had gotten cottonmouth so bad that it was almost impossible to swallow. Then I noticed that someone had stuck paper plates on the barbs of the wires of the fence. We looked, and there were plates stuck to the top strands of where the wire on both sides of the road. It started about 50 feet behind us and continued up and over the hill. They were evenly spaced about 5 feet apart, and as our gaze followed the row of paper plates up to the top of the hill, James suddenly said, "There's another fire." And it was that moment that I could smell it. But what I smelt wasn't a normal smoky smell. It was as though someone had added incense to it. I asked James if he could smell it. I told him I didn't like it at all. I was okay with losing face in front of our friends and his dad and brothers, and I was ready to go. He agreed with me, but said that we had to see what was burning. We were both whispering, and both so shaky that our voices quivered. We started up the hill again, and I was thinking, with every step, that we were going to be seriously killed or worse. As we got to the top of the hill, one of the paper plates blew off the fence and skittered behind us, making both of us jump, and we dared not scream. After we saw that, we laughed it off, but James shushed me and told me to listen. We could hear voices. As we topped the hill and were able to see the bottom where the road stopped, we saw a group of about 10 people, all standing around another recliner that was burning. They had their backs to us and were passing a big picture around. From our vantage point, we couldn't actually see what was in the picture, but the slit throat of the cow haunted my thoughts. They would each take a mouthful and spit the thing into the fire. This went on until the pitcher was empty. The entire time they were all saying something in unison. We could only understand an occasional word. They changed their tone in a rhythmic manner, with an emphasis on the last word, and I can remember hearing "here and there" and "beseech" and "father." James and I stood there on the top of the hill like a couple of idiots, our mouths hanging wide open and actually scared stiff. After a minute or two, they would repeat whatever it was, all the while passing that pitcher and spitting into the fire. There was a small camp table set up on the side and a little behind them. After the last of the liquid was gone, a man turned and sat the pitcher on the table and picked up what appeared to be a large loaf of bread. Just as he was turning back to the fire, he evidently saw us. I am sure that we made a nice silhouette, sitting there at the top of the hill. He screamed, "Hey!" and dropped the loaf of bread and started running in our direction. The others turned and immediately followed. That was all the encouragement that we needed. It was time to go. We turned our bikes around and James got his started on the first knock. But I somehow managed to get myself off balance, and when I kicked, the bike fell on its side with me. By this time I was in near panic and was breathing in raspy, short breaths. I picked up the bike again and tried to start it, but it didn't start. I thought about running, but we were in the middle of nowhere. I finally started pushing the motorcycle down the other side of the hill and jumped on it. It seemed like it took forever to get enough speed, but I popped the clutch and it started. James was waiting at the corner of the intersection to make sure that I was coming, and we headed for his house. Going way too fast for safety, especially in the dark. When we finally got back to his house, we told his dad what we had seen. His dad called a couple of friends, and they all loaded up their trucks with enough weapons to start a small war. James and I sat with his dad and told him where they were. His dad kept asking questions on that way, as in what they were doing, and why the chair was on fire, why they cut the cow's throat, how many were there, what they looked like and what they were driving. The last question stumped us. We hadn't seen any cars or trucks. The road was the only way in or out, and there was a creek that ran on the back side of the end of that particular road, so they couldn't have gone in that direction. How had they gotten there with 2 recliners? When we got to the last stretch of road, the headlights found the spot where the recliner had been sitting. It was gone. We could all see where the road and surrounding grass was burnt, but the recliner was not there. As we got closer, we noticed that the cow was gone as well. I hate to admit it, but I was getting scared all over again. I was afraid that his dad would tell us that it was in our imagination and not believe us. But when we got closer to the burnt spot, James's dad noticed the chair off in the ditch on the side of the road. Then I noticed the cow on the other. It was also in the ditch. The paper plates were all gone. Buster got out to look at the cow with the other men. They stood there talking and shaking their head for what seemed like 10 minutes before getting back in the truck. We continued towards the hill. The ruts made by the spinning motorcycle tires were easily seen, but there was no fire on the other side of the hill. We all went down where the other recliner had been burning. It and the camp table were gone. You could see where someone had walked around the charred area and covered it in dirt. And after we left, James saw a paper plate about 50 feet on the other side of the fence. James's dad called the county sheriff when we got home, and by that time it was daylight, and we went out again with the sheriff and a deputy. When we got back to the road, the first recliner and the cow were gone, but you could still see where something had been on fire, and there was still blood on the road and grass. James showed them the shoe prints we'd seen. At the bottom of the hill, you could still see the charred area where the second recliner had been burning, and the deputy found a little scuff mark where the table had been sitting. At the other end of the road, you could see where the top strand of the fence had been tugged down and wrapped around by the lower strand, so someone could crawl over it. You could also see where the grass and weeds had been trampled, providing a fairly easy trail to follow. We found a woman's tennis shoe on the other side of the creek. You could see where someone had climbed up that bank on the far side of the creek. We followed the trail all the way across the field to the next dirt road. Again, the top wire was wrapped around the next lower wire, and there was a piece of red bandana-looking material caught in it. There were marks on the road where 2 or 3 different cars had spun their tires when they left. Buster also found a large piece of glass that had blood on it. James's dad filed a report for the missing cow. They found 4 more cows in the opposite direction from where me and James had gone. They never found the recliners or the missing cow. The sheriff called a few days later and told James's dad that the blood on the grass was human and not bovine. It was his guess that the pitcher broke and someone cut their hand whilst carrying it back to the vehicle. 2 weeks after that, there was a huge scare in our community about some cult that had promised the area at large that they were going to sacrifice a blonde-haired virgin girl and boy. James's dad said that it was just someone running their mouth after hearing about the incident. It was all anyone talked about that summer. James's dad also said that he sure would like to know what happened to that cow. Back in 2007, shortly after my 15th birthday, my mom was out of town for a few days on a business trip. My mom and I lived alone in a small house in a neighborhood that was on the sketchier end of decent. And that fact, combined with her paranoia about me being home alone longer than 4 or 5 hours, meant that I had to stay over a friend's house while she was gone. This friend's house was across the street, and over 1 house from my own. The place my mom was going was only about 2 hours away. And I'd gotten a bug up my arse about being treated like the young woman that everyone kept calling me. So for the week leading up to the trip, I was moaning and groaning about being old enough to take care of myself, and insisted that I could just check in with my friend's parents every now and then. But in truth, my house was pretty creepy at night, when my mum was there with me, and I'd found out the day my mum was scheduled to leave that my friend had somehow gotten her hands on a PlayStation 3. So it didn't take me long to get over being unfairly babysat. At around 11 on the last night I was there, we ended up back in my friend's room screwing around with the brand new flip phone I'd gotten for my birthday. Her parents had gone out hours earlier, after buying us pizza for dinner, and probably weren't going to be back for at least an hour. We'd gotten bored downstairs with her one PS3 game that we'd been playing for days already. As it turns out, she had the PlayStation but didn't have any money to actually buy games for it. That's how it usually goes though, right? I was too late to call any of our friends, but I knew my mum was coming home tomorrow morning, at some ungodly hour, and I knew that she had this thing about our answering machine. No matter how tired she was, no matter how she gotten back, she would press the button and listen to all of them. Being the bored 15-year-olds we were, my friend and I decided to leave a message or two for my mum in the morning. We called my home phone and put it on speaker, cracking up and trying to figure out what our message was going to be. It normally took 5 rings for the call to go to the machine, but on the 3rd, the phone picks up and we hear, "Hello?" The voice sounded like it belonged to some 60-year-old guy who'd been smoking for the last 40. But even past that, there was this menace to his voice. I can't describe it, but it sounded very cold and very dangerous. The sort of voice you heard on the street that you knew you wanted to get away from that person immediately. I looked at my friend. Her eyes were huge and her face completely pale, and I'm sure I didn't look any better. Neither of us could get anything together to say a response. "Hello?" he said again. Then there was a pause, and I tried to squeak something to the lines of, "Who the hell are you and why are you in my house?" But then he said in a very low voice, "You shouldn't have called." And there was some sort of slam as the call disconnected. I immediately dropped my phone and proceeded to freak out, as did my friend. She asked me if I knew who that was, and I said no. Of course I didn't know the creepy-ass guy answering my phone at 11 at night. We checked the call log to see if we'd accidentally called the wrong number. Nope, right number. We were so shaken up that we couldn't immediately figure out who we called or what we should do. If we should call the cops, or call my mom or call my friend's parents, or run around making sure all the doors and windows were locked or what. So we ended up sprinting around my friend's house, double checking every lock we could, whilst gasping out of what happened to my friend's parents on the phone. They were about 15 minutes away and said they would call 911, and her mother told us to stay in my friend's room with the door locked and all the lights on in case the guy was going from house to house. And so for 10 minutes, we were huddled in the far corner of my friend's room, basically under her bed, jumping every time the house settled or one of our legs scraped on the carpet. The cops got to my house, and not too long after her parents got home. To be honest, I don't really remember a lot of the specifics about what the cops were doing, mainly because I refused to set foot outside the house. but I remember they asked my friend and I a lot of questions. We couldn't really give them a lot of info though. Unfortunately, we called from my friend's room, which was in the back of her house, away from where we would have been able to see my house and the dude with a creepy smoker's voice. It isn't a very helpful description to go off when you're looking for someone. One question they asked though stuck out, because I remember thinking it was weird for them to ask who had keys to get into the house. I told them my mum and I were the only ones with keys. I found out later that the reason the police asked was because there were no signs of forced entry anywhere around the house, and that the front door was wide open when they arrived. There wasn't really anything messed up, and nothing was taken, but our wall-mounted cord phone was hanging off the hook, and the phone base itself was cracked, like it had been smashed with something. Both my mum's room and my room had some stuff moved around and displaced, like someone was going through our drawers and the stuff in our rooms. My mum got called at some point during all of this and managed to get home that night, very tired and very freaked out about what happened. The cops investigated the incident, but never came up with any answers. We weren't doing too well financially at that point, but we still managed to move across town within a few months of this happening. For the months between that night and the day we moved though, I slept like shit and really had bad nightmares. I also flat out refused to be alone in the house, even for a couple of minutes, and I started getting really obsessive about checking and double checking the locks, a habit which has remained with me to this day. And now that I've said all this, I remember that there's one thing I haven't told anyone, mostly because of the time I thought the whole thing might get blamed on me. Earlier that day, I'd gone back over to my house to grab a notebook full of my writings that I wanted to show to my friend. Nothing was obviously wrong as far as I could tell. The front door was locked when I got to it, no signs of tampering with it or any weirdness by the door. No noises from any part of the house, but the minute I stepped inside, something just felt off. Really off. It was really quiet, and I was getting chills up and down my spine, and I had goosebumps all over. I tried to will myself to just get over it, to go back to my room and get to the notebook. But I couldn't make myself take more than a few steps into the house. So I locked the door and ran back across the street. When I got back to my friend's house, I felt like an idiot. Of course, was I really such a wimp that I couldn't walk through my own house when it was empty? But looking back, who knows? Maybe my gut was right about something, just not being right there. Freaks me out even thinking about what could have happened if I'd ignored it and walked further inside. I've thought back on that moment a lot too, wondering if maybe I left the door open when I left, but there's no way. I distinctly remember locking the deadlock and looking over my shoulder the whole time, because I had that burning, crawling feeling on the back of my neck, the one you get when you're being watched. And so after the creepy call, I checked and I had my keys in my backpack. I really hope I don't have the misfortune of encountering that creepy home intruder ever again. For many years, I spent my summers working in a major southern US city with a moderately high crime rate and some serious racial conflict. Now, I grew up in New York City and live there to this day, and I'm not overly afraid of walking around in some of my own city's more infamous areas at night, but I think it's important to respect the city you're in, and I knew that this southern city was quite a bit more dangerous for me to walk around in alone, especially as a young petite woman. I'm 5 foot and 105 pounds. I'm pretty strong, a lot stronger than most people think by looking at me, but I know better than to think I would do well in a one-to-one fight. To be honest, in my summer city, I wouldn't even usually walk home alone after work, since I worked until 10 PM. Even though it was only a 10-minute walk, it seemed silly to have to ask for a ride when it was a lovely and short walk through a gorgeous city. But I also knew that I didn't feel safe. It wasn't even the caution I have sometimes in a crummy neighborhood back home. It was a totally different feeling, a complete inability to be confidently safe. I loved my summers there, but I avoided being alone in the dark at all cost. But as it happens, we make little compromises. It was midnight, and the only other person in the office was staying for a few extra hours that evening. He asked me if I wanted him to drive me home, but I knew that would mean blocking the entire building up, driving 2 minutes and then 2 minutes back, and then disarming the security system again, blah blah. And I just felt silly, like a scared little girl. So I said I'd be okay, and that I only lived a few blocks away, and popped on my merry way. I walked with my head up, my stride sure, my ears open, just as I do back home. I got 1 block and then another. It was a gorgeous night, and I let myself enjoy it and relax a little bit, as I hoped in vain for a gentle breeze to cool me off a little, and enjoyed the symphony of various insects that came out at night. It was ungodly humid, and I didn't see a single other person. Definitely a different type of city than New York. But I could hear the gentle hum of nightlife from the main drag 1 avenue over. I got a 3rd block, and then I saw another person. A man. Of course, I thought to myself, as my anxiety ratcheted up, and I instantly admonished myself for my bias. I was out walking alone at night after all. Why didn't a man have the same right? But this has never happened to me before or since. Something about the sight of that man, that specific man, terrified me. I couldn't tell you why. He was in his mid-20s and had long, shaggy hair, and the moonlight reflected off him, and I could see it was blonde. Everything about him struck me as some sort of anomaly, and I don't mean to make judgments, but at that time of night, most people are in bed, or in a group, heading to some form of bar together. He looked like a surfer, not a stalker. He actually looked pretty cute, and yet I could hardly bear to look at him, because looking at him filled me with fear and apprehension. I know that you can never tell, but it really struck me how much this guy did not look like the sort of guy that would terrify me, and yet how absolutely terrified he made me feel, for reasons I couldn't articulate. There was nothing objectively scary about him, and yet I just felt this sickening dread as we slowly approached each other. It wasn't just that I was alone at night. I don't know what it was, but he scared me. He was walking towards me, and I had towards him to go home. We got closer, and he got bigger and bigger as he approached, and I felt smaller and smaller as I approached him. And get it over with. And yet, when I was about 20 inches away from him, I stopped. I don't know why. I really just didn't want to walk past him. It almost felt like I couldn't make myself go any closer. This is ridiculous, I thought to myself, and I even began to blush in the dark summer night, embarrassed by my behavior. But just to ease my mind, I crossed the street, feeling foolish. And then he crossed the street. "Don't come any closer," I said loudly, without even meaning to. It just came out of surprise. It surprised me how complete it was, how it was exactly what I felt, and exactly what I wanted most in the world at that moment, translated into words. How it was a command, not a request. Don't. I had never heard myself sound so sure of anything before in my life. Honestly, my voice was the first real sound I'd heard in several minutes, and I was surprised at how loud it felt, breaking the tension and finally starting this, whatever this was. He looked like it startled him too. "Don't be scared," he said after a moment, though he did stop walking towards me. "I'm not scared," I said. "I just don't want you near me." We stood there for a moment, at an impasse, looking at each other. "Please, I just got mugged. Someone stole my phone and wallet. I don't have any money, and I need to call someone." "There's a gas station 1 block over on that avenue. They have a phone." "I'm not from here, and I've had too much to drink and I don't want to get lost." We had the conversation, and I surprised myself with all the red flags I noticed as soon as they went up. His clear and sober sounding speech, his local sounding accent, the fact that I was the first to speak, the one to initiate the dialogue. When he is the one who needed help, you think he would have said something first. The weirdness of someone going out alone and getting drunk on their own in a strange city instead of hanging out with friends, or drinking moderately, or anything like that. I know it's not impossible. I've travelled alone myself and enjoy my own company in plenty of bars, but it all just seemed like a bunch of relatively less than common stuff, and all taken together, it made me wary. He continued, "Will you walk to the station with me? Or can I borrow your phone?" "No, you should turn right and walk until you come to the next intersection, and you'll be at a very busy road with a gas station on your left." "Please help me," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need help." He started walking again, towards me, slowly, like how you approach a cat. "Seriously, what's wrong with you? I just need help." I thought of my Leatherman and my flick knife, both of which I use regularly for work, both of which were buried somewhere in the bottom of my hellishly messy purse. My fingers twitched with longing, but I didn't want to be distracted, so I didn't fumble around for them. "I told you, don't come closer." I stepped backwards and hated myself for doing it. It felt like a sort of mini surrender, and he took another step forwards. "I won't hurt you." I began crossing the empty street, walking backwards at first just to keep my eye on him, and I said, "I'll scream. There's a cop who's stationed on a bike 4 blocks away. He's there every night, and he will hear me scream, and he'll be here in seconds. You really should turn right at the corner. It will take you directly to the gas station." "If you say so," he said. And I felt the distinct and chilling question within myself of whether, in his ambiguity, he was referring to the location of the gas station or the location of the police station. He didn't start walking. I stood there on the other side of the street, wary to take my eyes off him. But he didn't start walking. So I did. I walked until we were directly across the street from each other. And then I walked further. I glanced at him over my shoulder after a few steps, and he was still there watching me, going nowhere, just watching. I walked a few more steps and glanced over my shoulder at him again. He was still standing there. I quickly picked up the pace and went further away. Looking back, he was gone. Completely gone. He must have moved quickly, a lot quicker than he'd been moving before, when he was walking towards me anyway, to reach the intersection and turn right towards the gas station in just those few stops. I couldn't stop wondering where else he could have gone, moving that quickly, without me watching. I didn't think he could have crossed the whole street and managed to hide somewhere, at least not without me hearing. I glanced at the sidewalk across from me, and it was lined with trees and bushes. There were massive gardens all along it, all kinds of yards and stuff like that. There were almost no streetlights, and so many shadows. He could have been anywhere. I thought about turning down a side street and heading towards the main drag where all the bars and restaurants were. I glanced down one as I passed. No streetlights at all. Just sleepy, silent buildings all empty for the night, and the bright lights of the next avenue seemed impossibly far away. I kept going straight and tried to tell myself to calm down. He was just someone out walking alone, just like me, nothing more. I even managed to work up some guilt over not doing more to help him. I like to think myself as a good person, and it bothered me that I had been so rude to someone who may have actually needed help, but at the same time, I couldn't quite relax about it. I wanted to run. I wanted to run desperately. Maybe it was just the leftover superstition from childhood, but somehow I felt like the chase never truly began until you started running. So I walked, quickly. I looked back, and I saw shadows. So many shadows. I walked faster. I looked back, nothing but shadows. I would myself to calm, but it wouldn't happen. Finally, I approached the block where the cop on the motorcycle was always waiting behind a tree. With that grove in sight, I broke into a run. The chase was finally on, if it ever would be. I sprinted, and then the panic grew as I pushed even faster down that block. The cop heard me running his way, and he saw me and asked if I was okay. He asked as I approached him, still largely shrouded by the shadows of the trees around him, straddling his bike, peering out at me. "Yes," I replied, feeling silly immediately. "I'm fine, sorry, I just got scared." I smiled in apology and began to make fun of myself, the way we often do when we feel stupid. But the cop was already looking behind me over my shoulder. "Sir?" he called loudly, finally coming out of the shadows so he could be seen. "Can I help you with anything?" "No thanks," I heard a voice say. I turned around. The man maybe 30 feet behind me, just staring, looking. I can only think that he followed me after all, slinking along in the shadows, that he walked when I walked, and eventually He ran when I ran to keep up, even though running on full meant abandoning his cover. "Do you know him?" the cop asked. "No," I said quietly. "He told me he got mugged and he wanted me to help him. But I was scared, so I didn't. I didn't help him. Even in that moment, I felt a twinge of guilt. I waited for the man to come closer, to tell the cop he'd been mugged, to tell him he needed a phone, to prove that I was the horrible person in the situation, not him. He said nothing. He waved and turned and started walking the other way. He didn't look back. I waited with the police officer, and we walked with him for several minutes, and then I asked the cop to escort me back home a block away. When we got to my front door, the cop asked me if I was okay or if I wanted to make a formal statement. I couldn't really think of anything to say. I was out walking alone and saw another person out walking alone, and I yelled at him when he asked for help. And then he followed me, and I didn't really know if he was blonde. I was still a bit shocked and stunned, so I said no and thanked him for his help, and made my way home. I went inside and used my flashlight to go to bed, too scared to turn on the lights for fear that they would render me visible from the street. It wasn't until I was already laying down, sweltering in my unair-conditioned bedroom because I couldn't bear to open the windows, that I found myself wondering, if I hadn't have ran, if he had been forced to run and thus abandoned the silent but even cover of the shadows and trees, would the police officer have seen him at all? Or would he have remained hidden, watching me, following me right up to my very doorstep, lurking in my own bushes as I climbed the stairs to the porch and fought the key in the door lock? Would I have waved to the cop bravely, speed walking my way home, willing myself not to run, with that man slithering behind me the whole time, unseen by either of us? And if so, what then? I was about 14 when this happened. I was in my bed trying to sleep, but as always, I was failing. My dad was in the living room trying to rock my brothers asleep. This was a normal routine, but this night wasn't normal. I finally think I'm falling to sleep when I hear 3 loud knocks on the front door. It echoed throughout the whole house. It's 3 a.m. and the knocks are followed by a girl screaming. She screams for help and that her mother needs help, over and over. She was practically shrieking. My dad assumes it's some sort of trap. They use a little girl, Dad becomes vulnerable, opens door, and easy access inside the house and so forth. So he's yelling back at her to leave us alone through the door. The little girl starts crying, kicking our door over and over. Her screams still ring in my head every now and then. But by this point, I'm sitting upright in my bed, crying as well. I'm terrified and upset with my dad, because what if she needs help? So maybe 10 minutes go by of this continuous crying and screaming, when I hear a man outside my window, which is only a few inches beside my door. I hear him telling the little girl to shut up, and I can hear him grab her as she's screaming for him to let go. And I felt my stomach go sick. I wanted to look out my window, but I was paralyzed with fear. I can tell he's dragged her into the street. Her screams for her mother become quieter the further they got. And soon, I hear about 3 cars speed off down the street, and a lot of men were yelling. My parents called the police and tried to tell me to go to sleep, but I was too scared and traumatized. To this day, I think about that little girl and her mother all the time, scared of what might have happened to them. I used to want to know, but now I don't think I want to. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Make sure that you don't forget to drop that like and leave a comment to get your entry into the competition. And hit the little subscribe button and bell icon to be up to date with everything I post. And it also helps me out a bunch because it helps spread the joys of horror. I also want to give a big shout out to Tiffany Benfield. Thank you for your great comments as always, and I'm really happy that you enjoy the content. Thank you. If you would like me to read your story on my channel, all you needed to do is share it to my email or my Reddit, which can of course be found in the description. Please make sure to include as much description and punctuation as possible to maximize the chances of it being read. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.